Hello, my name is Ezekiel McCluskey, and I'm a graduate student at the University of Florida, working towards my license in mental health counseling. Today I want to talk to you about the myth of addiction. Now first, what do we think about when we think about addiction? We think about, often we think about a couple kids hanging out together, maybe doing drugs, that they're going down this wrong path, right? A lot of times the assumption is that that's how people get addicted, is by hanging out with the wrong people. Another thing is that a lot of people believe that simply from using drugs, you can become addicted. But that's just simply not true. There's actually research done in 1974, as far back as that, based on right after the Vietnam War. They were actually really concerned because they realized that a bunch of the soldiers that were over there, they were using heroin a lot, like regularly. They were addicted. And so they were worried when they came back, like, well, what's going to happen to these guys? What are we going to do about this? We're going to have addicts all over the street, right? But what actually turned out to happen is that when they came back, none of them really used. And the ones that did use didn't become re-addicted. Out of all the addicted people over there, when they came back, 4% re-addicted. So what does that tell us? We think about what was going on over there, and of course that was really stressful. It was a horrible thing to endure, to go through a war like that. But when they come back to a safe place, a good environment, they don't feel the need to do that anymore. Now, when I going through this video, I am pulling a lot of things from Johann Hari and Gabor Mate. Like, these guys have really built the foundation, I think, of what a lot of people are pulling from in addiction these days. Mate wrote an entire book, which we'll look at a little bit later. Hari did a TED Talk, which he kind of integrates a lot of the similar information, and we're going to look at that a little more as well. So another common idea is that addiction is an illness. And that kind of started a long time ago. Alcoholics Anonymous in 1939, they asserted, like in their big book, like that it's an illness. And that's how the way they describe it. And they even talk about it that way. If you go to a meeting right now, that's what they're going to say, is that it's an illness. And then looking at the American Medical Association, as far back as 1952, they referred to it. They started to come up with this disease model. So it's kind of an illness, something wrong with the body. But they do talk about, nowadays, it's referenced in the medical model. It's also it's discussed as potentially genetic, but also connected to, actually they definitely think it's genetic. I don't know if there's anything out there right now that's saying that they specifically don't, or they deny the genetic component, but we'll get to that in a minute. But they talk about the genetic plus the environment having a factor in influencing that, right? So it's kind of this mix of the two. But what that does, both of these, what they do ultimately is they kind of create this presumption of a genetic or biologic cause. As Gabor Mate points out, all twin research has been negated by the understanding that stress in the womb influences development. And what that means is, okay, so what they used to do to kind of prove, or what they do still, to kind of prove genetic connections in certain circumstances, right, is they can take two twins that were separated at birth, they were adopted out, so these people they both have identical DNA, so they can give them, if they go to two different places, and they end up with the same kind of situation, they end up with the same illness, or what have you, or mental struggle, psychological dysfunction, kind of these things. If that happens, then the assumption is, okay, then it's genetic, right? Like, if it happened in these two different situations, totally different environments, totally different families, yeah, right? But actually somebody questioned that, I guess, and they started looking into the womb and like the impact that the stress the mother has. Like when there's cortisol, if the mother's going through a difficult time, she doesn't want to adopt her kids, like I mean, that's got to be a hard thing to go through, right? And there could be all this stress going on. Well, they found that like when there's stress in the womb, when the mother is going through a difficult time, child's in utero, or the children, when they come out, they can put stress on them, and it can actually affect their life after coming out. So I guess that begs the question, so how do we know if it's the stress from when they were in there together, how do we know that that's not causing the problem? That's causing whatever we think is genetic is actually due to hormones while they were in the womb. So it really kind of muddies the water with all that. But Mate also says he's kind of like, well, regardless, genetic predispositions are of little importance when environment dictates the ultimate result. So he's like, really, we should just focus kind of on environment anyway. Like the genetic thing, I mean, okay, yeah, we could end up showing that, but like, you know, really, it's environment. Like that's what's going to trigger, that's what's going to make it come out. So let's look a little further. So addiction is complicated, you know. Mate says, I believe that if we look with an open mind at this phenomenon called addiction, the sense of mystery will be replaced by an appreciation of complexity. And it is complex, right? It could be all these things we're looking at. It could be those things, but it's also more, for sure. It's more than just like some genetic predisposition for something. There are things that happen in these people's lives. If you're around people with addiction enough, there's something there. There's something more than just the addiction. And Mate's book, by the way, is In the Realm of Hunger Ghosts, Close Encounters with Addiction. So if you're interested in this subject, he touches on everything from A to Z with addiction. Like there's 100 pages of showing you what addicts look like. He's a medical doctor. He works with them in a clinic, and he will talk about from everything, from the beginning to the end, like kind of what they go through, what their brain looks like, the neuroscience around all that. So I encourage you to look at that if you'd like to dig further. Human connection. Johann Hari did a TED Talk, and he asserted that a lack of connection and a fulfilling life is at the core of addicted people. So he pulls a lot of the similar stuff that Mate does, and that was ultimately his conclusion, is that isolation or lack of connection is the reason these people can't get away from drugs. It's not that they don't want to stop, you know. It's just they don't feel like they get what they need if they stop, and maybe they're leaning into that drug itself because of that. And he makes a comparison. He and Mate actually pulls on this too. Pulls from Rat Park. There was actually these two studies. So they compared two studies. So there's one study with rats where basically a rat was isolated and he had water or drugs, and he chose drugs while he was isolated. But then there was another study. They were like, well, what if we don't isolate them? What are they going to choose? Give them this like awesome rat park where they can go do whatever they want, go have fun, spin around on wheelhouses and go, you know, have sex with a lot of mates and all that. And like they found like, well, actually when they have a full life and they're connected and all these things, like that rat didn't want to take drugs. It didn't want to kill itself. It just wanted to have fun and live its life, which makes an interesting connection. So I think Hari makes a really valid point though. And then I found some research to kind of support that, you know, having a strong family connection does actually attribute to more resilience, greater life satisfaction, more optimism, more self-compassion, and higher self-esteem. I mean, think about that. That's everything you need. That's like your entire well-being. That's your capacity to bring back from things. Self-esteem, which is just like that fundamental, that core foundation to yourself. But then you have to think, you know, what might be the reasons for social isolation and connection breakdown? So what we're going to do here is we're going to kind of examine the early relationships in people's lives and see how the things that happen there, how that might, you know, intersect with addiction. Let's talk a little bit about attachment. Okay, so for those that aren't aware of what attachment is, I'll give it just a brief overview. We have anxious, insecure attachment, which is, well, let me go over all three. So anxious, insecure, avoidant, insecure, secure, and disorganized. Disorganized is often not talked about as much because it's kind of like basically you don't have a clear attachment. This is usually a child. An attachment happens, early on, very like in infancy stage. It's like about that connection with the primary caregiver, okay? And the disorganized is going to be one that basically had a very inconsistent, probably abusive, like a lot of things going on, so they don't have like a clear attachment of understanding. And attachment is just kind of how you relate to the world. Like secure is the ideal, and secure means that basically when you were little like that, you had all your needs met. Like you cried, when you were hungry and you were wet, everything, there was somebody there. And what that taught you is like the world is safe. The world's a safe place. And so there's not all this inner turmoil. You reach out and you get your needs met. Okay, but the other two, which are insecure, are avoidant, which is when you were in a situation when you were little, essentially kind of a parenting relationship where they just didn't meet your needs. They weren't there for you for safety. They didn't give you what you needed. They probably didn't give you what you needed emotionally or, physically. They just weren't there for you. And so you felt like you could not trust the world. You feel like you can't. And this is kind of what it kind of brings up in adults. And then anxious, insecure is more of like a confusing state. So your needs were kind of met sometimes, other times not so much. So you're kind of confused and you're kind of reaching out. Sometimes you're holding, sometimes you pull back, but sometimes you go forward. You're trying to figure things out, but trying to get what you need out there, but you just, it's confusing, So you're in this kind of like, this anxious is sometimes called anxious ambivalent because you kind of just don't know what to do. Okay, so what I found in the research when I was looking into attachment and its kind of a relationship to substance abuse, or to addiction specifically, insecure attachment is present in most addicts, was what they found. And anxious insecure, actually, the one that I talked about where you're really confused, is actually connected to severity of abuse, of like how much, how severe it is. So I also looked a little bit, so the flip side of that is that like when you do have that secure attachment, you also have usually have a positive psychosocial adjustment, which means that, like things are going well for you on the inside, so you have like these positive external relationships, so things are just kind of going well for you. Now when we look at abuse during childhood, I found a research study that was examining adverse childhood experiences. It utilized that survey, and by doing this, they can usually get large samples, and this was pretty large, 21,500. And what they found is that sexual abuse, physical abuse, and witnessing chronic domestic violence, like watching your parents fight, are significant predictors of adult drug and alcohol dependence. So when you're a little kid, whether you're getting abused or whether you're seen getting abused, it has a big impact. It hurts you. It's harmful. And ultimately, it predicts these kind of behaviors. And they said that another study I found that specifically sexually abused people are more likely to try intravenous drugs, which kind of just tells you how severe that is. Society generally kind of sees sexual abuse is pretty severe, and generally more severe than most abuses. And and we also see intravenous drugs as kind of like the more severe drugs, like heroin and things like that, people shooting up. So it kind of makes sense for those to be connected. Lastly, we're going to look at emotional harm. So and this is also, of course, during childhood. So all these things are kind of happening as you're a child. So they're all kind of connected in some ways, I think, as far as negative events during that time. But lastly, we're going to touch on emotional harm. And so this research was on 347 clients with alcohol dependence, and 42% of them had emotional neglect and abuse. So what is it like? Think about that. What is emotional neglect? Emotional neglect is like being cut off from connection. It's like an absence of connection. And what is abuse? Abuse is literally like doing direct damage to your connections. It cuts you off from that source. It makes you want to push it away. And I took a quote from that article. As the damaging consequences of emotional neglect have not been considered in most of the existing studies, our results indicate this group of traumatized individuals may need more attention and further research. And that's the truth. When I've looked at emotional neglect in the past, it's always caught me by surprise, and I think it catches a lot of people by surprise that it is incredibly harmful. And at times, like some research can say it's, and I don't have the research here with it, but I have looked at research before that said that it was even more harmful than other types of abuse. So it can be pretty severe. Like right here, almost half the people on alcohol dependence suffer from emotional neglect. So what does all this mean? I started out saying addiction is complicated because of the early history. I mean, the early history was simple, right? It said it was an illness. But then they were like, well, maybe there are environmental factors. And then the more and more we look at environmental factors, we start to realize there's such a big complexity to that. You know, Mate writes about a lot of different aspects of that. So again, I encourage you to read that book. And Hari really points to a lot of the same data, and in his conclusions that it's about connection. And if anything damages connection more, I would say it's your early childhood experiences, your years when you're trying to figure out how to connect. You're trying to figure out how to relate to the world. And if that is damaged, you grow up and you want to make those connections, but you just don't know how. And what happens with a person that doesn't know how, they have to choose other alternatives. They have to do something to kind of fulfill that need. So it makes sense that they would choose addiction. But what happens when you choose addiction? You end up harming all the people around you. You end up pushing everyone away. And you end up being further isolated, not knowing how to come back from that. I don't know how to come back from that. I think that's where a lot of the research needs to go now, is to try to figure out the solution. But what we have here is a way to stop it, or at least part of it. If these are great predictors, then if we target changing our behavior, how we treat our children, if we can get resources to people, help people learn how to parent in different ways, help people that push them, because maybe the parents in these situations need help. That's why, they might end up abusing their kids or taking out situations, I don't know. But if we can start to understand the causes, or what we think are at least things that are connected, or predictors of addiction, if we can start to work on those things, then maybe we can start to help prevent some of this. If we prevent that initial harm, then we prevent what they have to do to respond to it. And I really feel like these early childhood experiences are a big piece of this picture, but there's still more. There's still more. We have to keep looking and keep understanding the bigger picture. But it's so much more than just using drugs. It's not just about using drugs. You're not going to just get hooked. Anyone that just uses drugs. It just doesn't happen. There's so much more. There's so much more. I want to thank you for watching my video and taking the time here. And if you would like to have these slides, I would be happy to send them to you. They also have the references at the end, so you can do further research to any of the stuff you'd like to look at. My email is emclesk@ufl.edu. Again, it's emclesk@ufl.edu. Thank you.